The escalating trade war between China and the U.S. has now extended to the aviation industry. The Chinese government has ordered domestic airlines to stop accepting Boeing aircraft and U.S.-made aircraft parts as a retaliatory measure against President Trump's tariff policies. According to sources quoted by Bloomberg, under the ongoing tariff war, Chinese authorities have instructed domestic airlines to halt the pending deliveries of Boeing aircraft and stop purchasing any related parts and equipment from U.S. companies. This directive came after China's announcement on April 11 that it would impose a 125% retaliatory tariff on U.S. goods. This tariff increase is expected to more than double the cost of U.S.-made aircraft and components. At the same time, Chinese airlines still have hundreds of Boeing aircraft in their fleets that require maintenance, repair, and replacement. Industry data shows that Boeing has approximately 10 737 MAX aircraft ready for delivery to Chinese carriers. Among these, China Southern Airlines, Air China, and Xiamen Airlines each had 2 aircraft scheduled for delivery. Some of these planes have already arrived in China and are currently stationed at a maintenance center in Zhoushan City in Zhejiang. As these planes were delivered and payments made before the announcement of the reciprocal tariff, they may be handled on a case-by-case basis, allowing delivery to proceed. However, Boeing still holds a significant number of completed aircraft that were originally intended for Chinese carriers. China's 3 major airlines, Air China, China Eastern Airlines, and China Southern Airlines, had planned to receive 45, 53, and 81 Boeing aircraft, respectively, from 2025 to 2027. China Southern Airlines has paused the sale of 2 used Boeing 787-8 aircraft. Bloomberg reported that the airline intended to replace these U.S.-made wide-body jets with larger, newer models to enhance long-haul routes, but escalating U.S.-China trade tensions have disrupted this plan. On April 11, China Southern notified the Shanghai United Assets and Equity Exchange that the transaction was halted due to unspecified events, coinciding with China's announcement of a 125% tariff increase on U.S. goods. Nikkei previously noted that the suspension stemmed from concerns that trade tensions could impact plans to acquire additional Boeing aircraft. Bloomberg also reported on April 12 that Junyao Airlines postponed the delivery of a $120 million Boeing 787-9 originally scheduled for 3 weeks later due to intensified trade conflicts. Bernstein Research estimates that among Boeing's inventory, 27 737 MAX aircraft, along with several 787 and 777F models, were scheduled for delivery to China this year. Canceling these orders could result in a $1.2 billion cash flow loss. Bloomberg reported that mutual high tariffs between the U.S. and China are significantly increasing the cost of leasing Boeing aircraft for Chinese airlines. Consequently, Chinese authorities are considering measures, including financial support for airlines leasing these aircraft. Seth Safeman, an analyst at J.P. Morgan, said in a report that he does not believe China is critical to Boeing's growth in the coming years. However, in the long run, China will still play an important role in Boeing's market. On April 16, Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Lin Jian addressed reports that China directed its airlines to halt acceptance of U.S. Boeing aircraft deliveries, stating, "I'm unaware of the specifics. Please refer to China's relevant authorities." Neither the Ministry of Commerce nor the Civil Aviation Administration has commented on the matter. Ye Yaoyuan, a professor of international studies at the University of St. Thomas, observed that China's directive holds symbolic significance. With only 2 major global aircraft manufacturers, Boeing and Airbus, the latter offering lower prices, China's decision to block Boeing purchases reflects a superficial act of retaliation. However, Professor Ye noted that China's reliance on U.S. technology suggests it may face greater losses in the long term. Su Ziyun, director of the Institute of National Defense and Security Research in Taiwan, stated that while the U.S. may face short-term losses, many Chinese airlines depend on Boeing aircraft. A lack of spare parts could disrupt their operations. Bloomberg reported that Boeing's challenges in China have not impacted the company as severely as anticipated, with India absorbing some aircraft originally destined for Chinese airlines. Su Ziyun noted that China historically balanced aircraft purchases between Europe and U.S. manufacturers to maintain diplomatic ties. With strained U.S. relations, China is likely to redirect all orders to Europe. However, the C919, China's domestically produced aircraft, relies on U.S.-made engines. To reduce this dependency, China may shift the C919's electronic equipment, flight systems, and engines to European suppliers, incurring short-term losses while strengthening ties with the EU to counter U.S. influence. Su believes that, despite the tariff conflict, the EU will maintain ties with the U.S. due to critical security relationships and its focus on the North American market. Following two fatal crashes involving Boeing aircraft in 2019, China became the first country to ground the 737 MAX. In recent years, China's trade disputes with both the Biden and Trump administrations have led to a shift in Chinese orders towards European Airbus. However, it is unrealistic for China to transfer all Boeing orders to its competitor Airbus. Airbus has largely sold out its aircraft for the decade. According to BBC reports, Airbus has a backlog of over 8,000 aircraft orders and is facing its own supply chain issues, leading to delivery delays. In response to China's latest strike on Boeing, President Trump posted on April 15 on Truth Social saying, "Interestingly, China just reneged on the big Boeing deal, saying that they will not take possession of fully committed to aircraft." China's unilateral breach of contract has drawn criticism. Ye Yaoyuan stated, "China agreed to purchase Boeing aircraft, but now its government prohibits these purchases. Boeing can pursue legal action to enforce contract penalties. If enforced, these penalties would result in financial losses for Chinese companies, which they cannot easily avoid. To maintain international business, they must honor contracts with U.S. firms." Ye added that Chinese airlines will face higher operating costs to sustain global operations, further complicating international trade. While Boeing's loss of the Chinese market poses challenges, other markets can gradually compensate. If China continues to distance itself from the U.S., it risks significant economic disadvantages across various industries. Over the next 20 years, China is projected to account for 20% of global aircraft demand. While many orders may shift to Europe's Airbus, China is also relying on its domestically produced C919 to meet narrow-body aircraft requirements. The C919, a narrow-body aircraft with 150 to 190 seats developed by Comac, typically accommodates 168 passengers. Launched in 2008, the project planned its first prototype flight for 2014, but final assembly was completed in November 2015. Originally scheduled for delivery in 2016, it faced delays due to development challenges. The C919 completed its first flight on May 5, 2017, at Shanghai Pudong International Airport, received its airworthiness certificate in 2022, and began passenger operations on May 28, 2023. Promoted as China's first domestically developed commercial jet, the C919 has encountered persistent technical issues. On February 1, 2023, a C919 on a verification flight from Shanghai to Hefei via Beijing experienced a left engine thrust reverse failure upon landing at Beijing Daxing International Airport. The subsequent flight was canceled and the aircraft returned to Shanghai Hongqiao Airport. In May 2023, the C919 began commercial flights. However, on June 29, 2023, a C919 aircraft from Shanghai Eastern Airlines was unable to return to Shanghai after flying to Chengdu and was replaced by an Airbus A320. The following day, the C919 remained grounded, with the same flight replaced by an Airbus A20N. On July 1, 2023, the C919 resumed flights. During the Chinese Lunar New Year travel rush, the C919 operated multiple domestic routes across the country. Despite strict government controls, there were still some complaints about the C919 on social media. The C919, promoted as China's first domestically developed commercial jet, is assembled from various international components. It relies heavily on U.S. parts, including engines produced by CFM International, a joint venture between General Electric and Safran of France. Although the aircraft and certain components are manufactured on Chinese assembly lines, it depends on Western companies for intellectual property and after-sales support. Since late February 2024, the C919 has conducted demonstration flights in Southeast Asia, including Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Indonesia, and Malaysia, to explore market opportunities in the region. On April 14, 2024, President Xi Jinping visited Vietnam. On April 13, Vietnam issued a decree mandating that imported aircraft, including those certified by China's Civil Aviation Administration, meet specific requirements. That same day, Vietjet, a Vietnamese low-cost airline, signed a memorandum of understanding with COMAC in Hanoi. Reuters reports that Vietjet will lease 2 ARJ-21 aircraft operated by Chengdu Airlines for domestic routes from Hanoi to Phu Quoc and Ho Chi Minh City to Phu Quoc. However, Vietnam Airlines and Vietjet are pursuing additional Boeing aircraft purchases to address trade imbalances with the U.S. and mitigate the impact of high tariffs imposed by the U.S. administration. Under a 2019 China-EU agreement, European regulators must determine whether to validate the certification of Chinese aircraft to meet EU safety standards. Without EU approval, the C919 cannot operate in Europe. The C919 lacks certification from US or EU aviation authorities, creating challenges for its operations in Vietnam under current regulations, particularly for routes to Europe and the US. At the same time, China's domestic aircraft development faces additional obstacles. On January 6, the U.S. Department of Defense released an updated list of Chinese military companies in the Federal Register, which added 134 Chinese companies, including COMAC. Entities on this list may face restrictions, such as sanctions on goods and services. Following this, Chinese social media outlet China Civil Aviation published an article expressing concerns about COMAC's inclusion on the list, fearing it may encounter obstacles or even sanctions when importing U.S. products and technologies. This could lead to production delays for the C919 aircraft. The China Daily reported that if, amidst the escalating trade war, the U.S. cuts off China's access to these critical components, it could jeopardize China's aerospace projects, including the development of the larger C929. The U.S. holds a significant advantage over Beijing in the aerospace sector. The U.S. semiconductor export ban has already severely impacted China's semiconductor manufacturers. Should formal export restrictions be imposed on the aerospace industry, the production of the C919 could also face severe disruptions. The Wall Street Journal believes that China will eventually be highly motivated to make concessions. Both COMAC and Airbus may not be able to meet the massive demand for jets at the expected speed. U.S. President Trump has not yet revealed how he will respond to China's actions in this aviation trade war, which is closely linked to the ongoing tariff conflict. After 2 rounds of retaliatory tariffs, most goods imported from China are subject to a 145% tariff, while China has imposed a 125% tariff on most U.S. imports. On April 15, White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt read President Trump's latest statement on tariffs, emphasizing that the U.S. is in no rush to reach a trade agreement while China needs one. In the press conference, Leavitt read an additional statement that Trump had just written in the Oval Office.
The ball is in China's court. China needs to make a deal with us. We don't have to make a deal with them. There's no difference between China and any other country except they are much larger.
The statement continued, and China wants what we have, the American consumer, or put it another way, they need our money. Leavitt said, the president has made his position on China quite clear. The president has again made it quite clear he is open to making a deal with China, but China needs to make a deal with the United States of America. In an interview with journalist Tucker Carlson, U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said China receives a massive annual capital net inflow from the U.S. through trade, and without that money, they cannot survive. The U.S. government announced the initiation of an investigation into critical mineral imports on April 15. Since President Trump's announcement of the reciprocal tariff plan on April 2nd, over 75 countries have discussed new trade agreements with Washington, while China has opted for retaliation. The White House fact sheet reads, China faces up to a 245% tariff on imports to the United States as a result of its retaliatory actions. This includes a 125% reciprocal tariff, a 20% tariff to address the fentanyl crisis, and Section 301 tariffs on specific goods, between 7.5% and 100%, originally put in place during the Biden administration. Therefore, some products from China, the actual tariff could be as high as 245%. Reports have suggested that the U.S. plans to ask for over 70 countries currently negotiating trade deals to promise not to allow China to transship goods through them and to prevent Chinese companies from evading U.S. tariffs. Chinese scholar Peng Hongwen told Radio Free Asia that the tariff war between China and the U.S. could continue for a long time. First, Trump has said that the U.S. doesn't have to make a deal with the U.S., and China has made it clear that if the U.S. does not lower tariffs, we will not negotiate. Peng believes that the tariff war could evolve into a full-scale economic war. Even if some technical agreements are made, it does not mean that the economic war between China and the U.S. will end. The escalating tariff conflict between the U.S. and China is causing bilateral trade to stagnate. In 2024, total trade between the two countries exceeded $650 billion. Following the U.S. implementation of reciprocal tariffs, cargo throughput at Chinese ports has significantly decreased. According to China's Ministry of Transport, from April 7 to the 13th, cargo throughput at Chinese ports fell by 9.7% compared to the previous week, reaching 244 million tons. This decline is notably higher than the 0.88% drop recorded the week before the initial announcement of the reciprocal tariffs. Container throughput also decreased by 6.1%, reversing a 1.9% increase from the previous week. China expert Wang He noted that exports to the U.S. constitute approximately 1/7 of China's total exports, and shipments are currently facing significant obstacles. He stated, "This is unprecedented since Nixon's visit to China in 1972. Even after the 1989 Tiananmen Square sanctions, U.S.-China trade did not experience such conditions."